I've learned that the most expensive things in life rarely look expensive in the moment you hand them over. My name is Renee Calloway. I'm 34 years old, and for the last 11 years I've worked as a senior title and escrow processor at a mid-sized real estate firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. If you've ever closed on a house, refinanced a mortgage, or fought your way through a lien dispute, someone like me sat behind the paperwork making sure your name actually ended up on the deed, that the chain of title was clean, that nothing buried in county records could rise up later and take the roof from over your head. It's not a glamorous job. Nobody puts title processor on a vision board. But it teaches you something most people never learn until it's far too late. That ownership isn't about who feels like they belong somewhere. It's about whose name is recorded on the document. That Father's Day, I sat at my father's dining table in the house on Willowbrook Lane, and the smell of rosemary chicken and the citronella candle Diane always burned on the back porch drifted through the open window along with the sound of someone's phone playing music too quietly to identify. 12 of us were crammed around a table built for 8. My cousin Marissa bounced her new baby on her knee. Tyler's girlfriend of the month kept refilling her wine glass and laughing a half-second too early at everything he said. And I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, watching my family laugh at a $41 watch I had worked overtime for 3 months to afford. 6 extra shifts, back-to-back, on top of a full workload of closings and title searches, just so I could hand my father something that said "I see you." I want you to picture the object itself for a second, because the story isn't really about the watch. It's a simple gold-tone face, a brown leather band. Nothing you'd look twice at in a store window. On the back, I'd paid an extra $8 to have it engraved. For Dad. Every second counts. Renee. I'd chosen those words carefully. I'd sat in the parking lot of the engraving shop for 20 minutes trying to decide if it sounded too sentimental, too plain, too much like something off a greeting card. In the end, I decided it didn't matter how it sounded. It only mattered that it was true. My stepbrother, Tyler, picked it up before my father even had a chance to. He turned it over in his hand the way you'd inspect a knockoff handbag at a flea market, testing the weight, running his thumb across the clasp like he was checking for a manufacturer's stamp. "Seriously," he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, loud enough that Marissa's baby flinched at the volume. "Looks like something from a dollar store." Here's a fact I want you to sit with for a second because I did. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel in the way you'd expect cruelty to sound. It was worse than cruel. It was comfortable. It was the kind of laughter that comes easily because it's been rehearsed 100 times before, in 100 smaller moments, until it's just muscle memory. Ants I had known my entire life chuckled without even glancing my direction. My father's second wife, Diane, hid her smile behind the rim of her wine glass, not quite committing to it, but not stopping it either. And my father, the man I had quietly kept from losing the very house we were sitting in, reached over, picked up the watch, glanced at it for maybe a full second and a half, and set it back down on the tablecloth like it was a coaster that had done its job. "It's fine, sweetheart," he said. I want you to really hear that sentence the way I heard it, because it's the kind of sentence that sounds harmless if you're not the one it's aimed at. "It's fine, sweetheart." Not "thank you." Not "this is thoughtful." Not even a real look in my direction. His eyes were already back on his plate, already moving past me toward whatever Tyler was saying next. It was the verbal equivalent of a hand waving away a fly. 4 words, delivered flat, and then gone, already forgotten by everyone at that table except me. If you've ever sat somewhere and felt yourself get smaller with every second that passed, you already know exactly the feeling I'm describing. You already know what it's like to hold something enormous inside your chest, something that could rearrange the entire room if you said it out loud, while everyone around you assumes you've brought nothing to the table at all. Here's what none of them knew. Here's the detail that makes this story worth telling. 3 weeks before that dinner, I had taken a call from an attorney's office finalizing paperwork on a piece of property. Not a metaphorical piece of property. This one. The house on Willowbrook Lane, with its rosemary chicken smell and its citronella candle and its dining table meant for 8 now holding 12. My name was on that property in a way none of them understood. Not sentimentally, not in the "I helped out with a mortgage once" sense families like to be vague about at holidays, but legally. Recorded. Searchable in any title database in the state of North Carolina by anyone who knew where to look, which, as it happens, was exactly my job. They were laughing at a $41 watch. They had no idea they were sitting inside my leverage. I didn't say a word about it that night. That wasn't the moment for it. I want to be honest, even now, that walking around with that kind of knowledge and choosing silence takes a specific kind of discipline. The same discipline I use every day reviewing a title report line by line before I let it move forward. Instead, I reached into my bag, pulled out a small white envelope I'd been carrying around, unopened by anyone but me, for 19 days, and slid it across the tablecloth toward my father. "Just open this instead," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, shaking in a way I hoped nobody else could hear. He tore it open carelessly, still half laughing at whatever Tyler had said next, clearly expecting nothing more than a Hallmark card with a generic sentiment printed inside. I watched his eyes drop to the first line. I watched his jaw stop moving mid-chew on a piece of chicken. I watched his jaw stop moving mid-chew on a piece of chicken. I watched the color leave his face in stages, the way it does when someone reads something their body understands before their mind fully catches up. That letter wasn't about the deed. Not yet. The deed was still folded away in a manila envelope in my home office. A secret bigger than anything I was ready to say out loud at a dinner table full of people who thought a $41 watch was something to laugh at. That letter was about something else. Something I'd been carrying alone for over a year. Something that had cost me sleep, meals, a cancelled trip to Savannah, and every extra shift I could pick up without collapsing. But it was the first domino. And once it fell, nothing at that table. The laughter, the wine glasses, the comfortable cruelty everyone had rehearsed for years without ever noticing they were doing it. Stayed to understand why that dinner table went from laughter to dead silence. You need to understand who I was in that family long before I became who I am now. I was born to my father, Walter Calloway, and my mother, Linda, a schoolteacher who passed away from ovarian cancer when I was 19 years old. I remember the specifics of that year with a clarity I wish I didn't have. The fluorescent lights in the oncology waiting room, the exact shade of teal on the hospital's visitor badges, the way my mother's laugh sounded thinner every month until, by the end, it was barely a breath with a shape to it. 2 years after her funeral, my father married Diane, a woman he'd met at a work conference, and Diane came with a teenage son named Tyler who was, from almost the very first family dinner, treated less like a stepson easing into a new household and more like the second coming of the Calloway family legacy. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because it's a fact pattern, and in my line of work, I've learned that fact patterns don't need emotional language to be devastating. They just need to be laid out clearly in order so that anyone looking at them can see the shape of what happened. Again, fact. When I graduated with my associate's degree in paralegal studies at 21 and landed my first job at a small title company in Matthews, North Carolina, making $34,000 a year, my father asked me, not unkindly but not warmly either, if I'd thought about doing something a little more ambitious. Fact. 5 years later, when Tyler dropped out of 2 different community colleges, one for a communications program he never finished, one for an entrepreneurship certificate, he abandoned after a single semester, and eventually took an unpaid internship at a friend's used car dealership in Concord, my father called him, in front of the entire extended family at a 4th of July barbecue. A late bloomer with real potential. Fact. For my 25th birthday, my father forgot entirely. He called 4 days later, apologetic, distracted, blaming a work deadline. For Tyler's 25th birthday, 6 months after mine, there was a catered backyard party with 60 guests, a rented margarita machine, and a toast my father gave that lasted almost 4 minutes. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you this because it matters enormously for what happens later in this story. Because the version of Renee who sat quietly through years of being overlooked is the exact same version of Renee who, without anyone in that family noticing, ended up holding all the real power at that table. And there's a lesson buried in that, if you're the kind of person who's ever felt invisible in your own family. The people who get underestimated are often the ones quietly accumulating the most leverage, the most competence, the most institutional knowledge about how the world actually works. Nobody watches the boring, responsible one closely. Which means nobody sees her coming. Let me give you a few more specific examples because vague resentment is easy to dismiss and specific facts are not. 2 Thanksgivings before that Father's Day dinner, I paid for the entire meal myself. $312 in groceries, 6 hours of cooking, 2 full rounds of cleaning the kitchen before and after. When my father stood up to give his customary toast, he thanked Diane for holding this family together, and he thanked Tyler for driving all the way in from Raleigh. A 90-minute drive he made maybe twice a year. He didn't mention me at all. I was standing 4 feet away from him holding a gravy boat, close enough that I could have reached out and touched his sleeve, and he looked straight past me like I was part of the wallpaper. Another example, and this one still sits in my chest like a stone. When my car's transmission failed and I needed $1,800 for repairs, I didn't even consider asking my father. By that point I'd learned better. I took out a personal loan instead, at 14% interest through a credit union, and paid it off methodically over 11 months, tracking every payment in a spreadsheet the same way I track escrow disbursements at work. 6 weeks after my loan closed, Tyler wrecked his car in a Target parking lot. Not another vehicle, just a light pole at low speed, cosmetic damage mostly. And my father wrote him a check for $4,200 without so much as a follow-up question, calling it, just this once because family takes care of family. Family takes care of family. I used to turn that phrase over in my mind for hours, the way you'd examine a document for a clause that doesn't quite make sense, because from where I was sitting, it seemed to only ever move in one direction. It flowed toward Tyler, effortlessly, like water finding the easiest path downhill. It never once flowed back toward me. Here's the pattern interrupt I need you to sit with for a moment, because it's the hinge this whole story turns on. What none of them knew. Not Diane, not Tyler, not a single aunt or uncle laughing at that watch, was that 18 months before that Father's Day dinner, my father had quietly stopped being able to take care of himself financially at all. And out of everyone in that family, out of everyone who called themselves close to him, I was the only one who found out. It wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. Let's go back to that Father's Day table because I need you to feel the exact texture of that moment before I tell you what happened next. The sounds, the smells, the specific wait of 30 seconds that changed the direction of my entire family. The dining room smelled like rosemary chicken and the citronella candle Diane always burned on the back porch, the smoke drifting faintly through the screen door every time someone walked in or out. There were 12 of us crammed around a table meant for 8, aunts and uncles elbow to elbow, my cousin Marissa bouncing her new baby on one knee while trying to eat with the other hand, Tyler and his girlfriend of the month, whose name I genuinely could not remember despite 3 prior introductions. I'd worked a double shift the Friday before just to make sure I could afford something meaningful, staying 2 extra hours past close to finish a batch of title searches that weren't technically due until Monday, and after weeks of quiet research on my lunch breaks, I'd settled on a simple gold tone watch. Not real gold, I want to be honest about that detail because this story was never about the object itself, it was about what the object represented. $41 and change, plus $8 for engraving on the back. For Dad. Every second counts. Renee. When Tyler picked it up and made his dollar store comment, I watched my father's face carefully. The same way I watch a client's face during a difficult closing, looking for the micro-expressions that tell you what someone actually believes before they say the diplomatic sentence out loud for the room. And for just a half second before he composed himself, I saw something that hurt far more than the laughter itself. Agreement. He agreed with Tyler. He was just too polite or too tired or too far removed from the effort behind that gift to say it out loud. "It's fine, sweetheart," he said, and set it down on the tablecloth like it was a coaster that had finished its job. "I want to be honest with you about something because I think it matters. In that exact moment, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't thinking about the deed sitting in a folder in my home office, or the mortgage restructuring I'd quietly handled 18 months earlier, or any of the leverage I now technically held over every person laughing at that table. I was just a daughter who had worked 6 overtime shifts across 3 months, trying to buy her father something small that said, without needing to say it directly, "I see you, even when you don't see me." But watches can be replaced. Words, once spoken into a room like that, cannot. I reached into my bag. My hands were shaking, and I remember thinking with a clarity that surprised me, if I don't do this now, I never will do it. I pulled out the white envelope I'd been carrying in my bag for 19 days. I know it was 19 because I'd written the letter the night after I received a call from the hospital's billing department confirming the account was, at long last, paid in full, and I had been too afraid to hand it to him every single day since. "Just open this instead," I said. He tore it open the way you'd open junk mail, still half laughing at Tyler's joke, clearly expecting nothing heavier than a Hallmark card with a generic sentiment printed inside. I watched his eyes move down the page. I watched the exact moment his jaw stopped moving mid-chew on a piece of chicken. I watched the color drain slowly from his face, the way it does when a person's body understands something a full beat before their mind catches up to it. The letter told him something I had kept from him for over a year, that after his gallbladder surgery went sideways into a 6-day hospital stay, and after his insurance denied nearly $34,000 in claims over what they vaguely called pre-authorization discrepancies, I had been the one quietly negotiating with the hospital's billing office, setting up a payment plan under my own name and paying it down, month by month, using overtime shifts, a cancelled vacation to Savannah I'd already put a deposit on, and a second job doing weekend title searches for a smaller firm out in Gastonia. He had believed the bills simply mysteriously disappeared. I hadn't corrected him. I hadn't wanted the thank you. I had only wanted him to keep sleeping through the night instead of staring at collection notices at 2 in the morning the way I sometimes still did. The table went silent in a way I had never once experienced in that house. Not the light, awkward silence of a joke that fails to land, but the heavy, suffocating silence of an entire room realizing, all at once, that they had badly misjudged someone sitting right in front of them. "Why didn't you tell me?" my father finally choked out, his hands trembling around the pages, his voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since we buried my mother. "Because I didn't want your love," I said quietly. "I just wanted you healthy." He came around the table and pulled me into his arms, sobbing in a way I hadn't witnessed since my mother's funeral 15 years earlier. Great, heaving breaths, his hand gripping the back of my shirt like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. And for a moment, just one brief moment, I let myself believe this was the ending. That the truth about the hospital bills was the largest secret I was carrying, and that this embrace, this apology 15 years in the making, was as far as the story would go. It wasn't. Because the hospital bills weren't the only thing I had been quietly handling behind the scenes. And what I hadn't told him yet, what none of them knew, not even Diane, not even Tyler, who at that exact moment was still holding the $41 watch loosely in his hand, no longer smirking. His expression somewhere between confusion and the first flicker of alarm, was that 4 months after I made that final hospital payment, I had discovered something far more serious buried in a stack of unopened mail on my father's kitchen counter. Something with the county seal stamped across the front. Something that meant, if I hadn't acted exactly when I did, none of us would have been sitting around that table in that house at all. I need to take you back 4 months before that final hospital payment cleared, because that's when I found the second secret, the one that made everything else in this story possible. It was a Tuesday evening in March, cold enough that I still had my coat on when I let myself into my father's house with the spare key I'd had since college. I was there to drop off a casserole, nothing more dramatic than that. Diane had mentioned offhand at a family lunch that she'd been swamped, and I'd taken it as my cue, the way I always did, to quietly handle something before anyone had to ask twice. My father wasn't home. Diane was at her sister's. The house had that particular stillness houses get when nobody's occupied it in a few hours, the refrigerator humming, a single light left on over the stove. I set the casserole dish on the counter and that's when I saw it. A stack of mail maybe 2 weeks deep, shoved into the corner behind the fruit bowl the way people hide things they don't want to look at but also can't bring themselves to throw away. Bills mostly. A charity solicitation. And underneath all of it, an envelope with a return address I recognized instantly, because I'd seen thousands of envelopes exactly like it in the course of my job, the Mecklenburg County Clerk of Superior Court. I want to be honest with you. I almost didn't open it. It wasn't addressed to me, and some small, polite part of me knew that. But 11 years of processing title reports had trained a different instinct into me, one that doesn't fully turn off just because I'm standing in my father's kitchen instead of my office. I recognized the weight and size of that envelope. I recognized, with a sick drop in my stomach, exactly what kind of document lives inside an envelope like that. Opened it. It was a notice of default and intent to foreclose, filed by the mortgage servicer holding the note on Willowbrook Lane. My father was $18,600 behind on payments, spread across 11 missed months, and the notice stated plainly, in the flat legal language I read every single day at work, that the property would proceed to a foreclosure sale in 90 days if the arrears weren't cured. 90 days. I remember doing the math standing right there at the counter, the casserole dish still warm against my forearm, counting backward to figure out exactly which date on the calendar this house. The house my mother had picked out the flooring for, the house I'd grown up in before the divorce split our family's geography in half, would be auctioned off on the courthouse steps to the highest bidder. That should have been the moment I called my father immediately. It wasn't. And here's why, because I think the reasoning matters. I knew my father well enough to know that confronting him directly, especially with Diane in the house, would trigger shame before it triggered action. And shame, in my father's case, tended to produce silence and avoidance rather than solutions. I'd watched him do it before. Smaller version years earlier, with a car repossession he never told anyone about until the tow truck was already in the driveway. I didn't want a repeat of that. I wanted this handled quietly, correctly, and fast. So instead of calling him, I called myself into action. The following morning on my lunch break, I pulled the full title report on Willowbrook Lane through our office database. Something I technically wasn't supposed to do for a property I had a personal relationship with, a fact I want to be honest about, because it's the first small rule I bent in this entire story. What I found was worse than the notice alone suggested. My father had refinanced the house 6 years earlier under a variable rate loan he clearly hadn't fully understood, and after his gallbladder surgery and the mounting medical bills that followed, he'd simply stopped being able to keep up. There was also a second lien on the property. A small home equity line Diane had taken out for $22,000, mostly drawn down, with a balloon payment structure that made the whole situation considerably worse than the foreclosure notice alone let on. What they didn't know was that I had spent 11 years learning exactly how to read a document like that one. Most people, looking at a notice of default, feel only fear, an abstract, paralyzing dread with no shape to it. I felt something closer to clarity. I could see, line by line, exactly what needed to happen to stop this. A reinstatement of the loan, a negotiated forbearance plan, or the option I quietly started exploring within 48 hours. A full refinance under new terms, potentially under a different name on the note entirely, if the original borrower's credit and income could no longer qualify on their own. I called a loan officer I'd worked with professionally for 6 years. Someone I trusted enough to bring a personal situation to without it becoming office gossip. I didn't tell him it was my father's house at first. I framed it as a hypothetical, the way you do when you're testing whether an idea is even viable before you commit to it out loud. Could someone refinance a property in default, cure the arrears, and take over the note if their income and credit supported it, even if they weren't currently on title? He said yes. Complicated, but yes. And that's the exact moment this story stopped being about a casserole dish and a stack of unopened mail, and started being about 90 days, one spreadsheet, and a decision I made alone in my car in my father's driveway, without telling a single member of my family what I now knew. Because here's the thing about being the responsible one, the boring one, the one nobody watches closely. By the time anyone else in that family noticed anything was wrong, I had already decided exactly what I was going to do about it. 90 days sounds like a long time until you're the one holding the clock. I drove home from my father's house that Tuesday night with a foreclosure notice folded into my coat pocket, and I remember sitting in my car in my own driveway for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Not because I was afraid. Because I was calculating. That's the closest word I have for what that 20 minutes actually was. Not panic, not grief, just my mind running through every version of what could happen next. The way I'd run through contingencies on a complicated closing that had 3 liens and a title defect and a seller who wasn't being fully honest about who actually owned the mineral rights. I want to walk you through exactly what those 90 days looked like, because the middle of a story like this is where people usually expect either nothing to happen or everything to happen at once, and the truth is neither of those is accurate. The truth is quieter and more procedural than that, and I think the procedural part is exactly what made it work. Week 1, I pulled my own credit report and ran the numbers 3 separate times, the way you'd triple-check a wire instruction before releasing 6 figures of somebody's life savings. 11 years at my firm had given me a credit score just north of 780 and a debt-to-income ratio clean enough that, on paper, I looked like a dream borrower. I also pulled 2 years of my pay stubs and my most recent tax returns, because I already knew, from doing this exact type of file professionally, precisely what documentation a lender would eventually ask for, and I didn't want to be scrambling for it under a countdown clock. Week 2, I met with a loan officer, Marcus, in person this time, no longer hypothetical. I laid the entire situation out for him. The default notice, the 11 missed payments, the second lien Diane had taken out without, as far as I could tell, my father fully understanding the balloon structure attached to it. Marcus ran preliminary numbers and told me something that landed heavier than I expected. Even with my credit, taking on a $214,000 mortgage plus curing $18,600 in arrears plus dealing with a second lien would put my monthly obligation somewhere around $2,100, more than half of what I was bringing home after taxes. That's the number I sat with for 3 sleepless nights, turning it over the way you'd turn over a stone looking for the crack underneath it. Week 3 is when I started making the calls I hadn't told anyone about. Not my father, not a single member of my family, not even my closest coworker. I called the hospital's billing office first, because those bills were still an open wound sitting alongside the mortgage crisis. 2 separate financial emergencies converging on the same overwhelmed man at the same time. I negotiated the $34,000 in denied claims down to $27,400 through a hardship program most people never even know exists unless they specifically ask a billing supervisor for it by name. And I set up a payment plan under my own name so the collection calls to my father's house would simply stop. Here's a pattern interrupt because I think you need one right about now. This wasn't a moment of dramatic sacrifice with violins swelling in the background. It was a series of boring administrative decisions, made one at a time, mostly on lunch breaks and in parking lots, that happened to add up to something enormous. Week 5, Marcus called back with the actual refinance terms. I qualified, but only if I restructured the deal in a specific way. The property would need to be transferred via quit-claim deed from my father into my name, with a side agreement, drawn up by an attorney I hired privately, granting him a life estate. In plain language, that meant he would legally retain the right to live in the house for the rest of his life, protected on paper, even though the mortgage and the title would sit entirely in my name. It also meant that Diane's home equity line, still attached to the old title, would need to be paid off and released before the transfer could close cleanly. Otherwise, the lien would follow the property regardless of whose name sat on the deed. I paid off Diane's $22,000 home equity balance using a combination of my savings, a portion of a small inheritance from my mother's side of the family that I had never touched, and a loan against my 401k that I am, even now, still paying back. I didn't tell Diane. I didn't tell my father. I told the closing attorney in confidence exactly one thing, that this transaction needed to happen quietly, without a single phone call to Willowbrook Lane, until it was fully recorded with the county. Week 8, the reinstatement funds cleared. curing the 11 months of missed payments in a single wire transfer that emptied nearly every account I had. Week 9, the refinance closed. I sat in a conference room I'd sat in dozens of times before as an employee, except this time I sat on the other side of the table, signing my own name onto a 30-year note, my hand steady even though my stomach was in knots, while a notary I'd worked alongside for years stamped documents that quietly transferred the deed to my father's house into mine. That's the moment everything shifted, though nobody but me and a handful of professionals sworn to confidentiality knew it yet. By week 11, the recorded quitclaim deed was searchable in the county system, my name sitting cleanly on title, the foreclosure notice cancelled and marked satisfied. My father never received a single letter about it, because I'd redirected the correspondence address on the new loan to a P.O. box I'd rented specifically for that purpose. He went on believing for the next 18 months that some combination of luck and a forgiving lender had quietly resolved a problem he'd been too ashamed to mention to anyone. He had no idea the house he'd raised me in no longer belonged to him. He had no idea that the daughter he thanked with 4 dismissive words over a $41 watch was the only reason he still had a roof to sit under while he said them. And sitting there at that Father's Day table, watching him read the hospital bill letter, I understood something with total clarity. That letter was only going to tell him half of what I'd done. The other half, the deed, the life estate, the 11 weeks that had quietly rearranged the legal foundation of his entire life, was still folded away in a manila envelope in my home office. He didn't know yet, but he was about to. There's a version of this story where I stop right there, where the letter about the hospital bills is the whole reveal, where my father cries, we hug, the family learns a small lesson about gratitude, and the story ends on a warm, tidy note. I want to be honest with you about why that isn't what happened, because the real ending required one more piece of information to come out, and it didn't come out that night at the table. Came out 3 weeks later, and it came out because of Tyler, not because of me. What they didn't know was that the quiet part of this story was never really about my father at all. It was about what happens when the people who benefit from someone's silence assume that silence is permanent. After that Father's Day dinner, things were different in small, tentative ways. My father called me twice that week, which was unusual. Normally we spoke maybe once every 10 days, brief and logistical. He asked about my job. He asked if I needed anything. Once, almost shyly, he asked if I still had the watch, and when I told him yes, sitting in my nightstand drawer, he went quiet on the phone for a few seconds before changing the subject. I want to be clear that I wasn't holding out for some enormous emotional transformation. I'd lived 34 years without one, and I'd made my peace with the idea that some fathers say the important things sideways, in small gestures, rather than head-on. Tyler, on the other hand, seemed to experience the dinner very differently than I expected. Rather than reflecting on the moment where he'd mocked a gift representing months of overtime and quiet sacrifice, he seemed, if anything, irritated that the spotlight had shifted away from him for an evening. I heard about this secondhand from Marissa, who mentioned at a cousin's baby shower that Tyler had complained to Diane that I'd made the whole holiday about myself, and that the letter had been kind of a guilt trip, honestly. I didn't say anything when Marissa told me that. I just filed it away the way I file away an inconsistency in a title report. Not urgent yet, but worth remembering. 3 weeks after Father's Day, my father called me on a Wednesday evening. His voice tight in a way I recognized immediately as the sound of a man trying to stay calm while delivering bad news. Tyler, he told me, had asked to borrow $15,000 against the house. Not from a bank. From my father directly, framed as a personal loan, to cover what Tyler described as a business opportunity. A stake in a friend's used car dealership, the same dealership where he'd once done his unpaid internship years earlier. My father, still riding the emotional high of the hospital bill revelation, still eager to prove that gratitude and generosity flowed in every direction in this family, had apparently told Tyler he'd figure something out, possibly by taking out a home equity line against Willowbrook Lane. I remember the exact sound of my own voice going very flat and very calm on that call, The way it does at work when someone's about to make a 5-figure mistake and hasn't realized it yet. "Dad," I said, "you can't take out a home equity line on that house." "Why not?" he asked, genuinely confused. "It's my house." That was the moment everything shifted again. The second time in this story that a single sentence rearranged everything. I sat with the silence on the line for a moment longer than was comfortable, because I understood with total clarity that this was the conversation where the second secret had to come out. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. Because if I let that conversation end without correcting him, Tyler's $15,000 business opportunity was going to collide, within days, with a legal reality nobody in that family understood yet. And the collision would be far messier if it happened without warning than if I explained it to him now, gently, in private on the phone. "Dad," I said, "it's not your house. Not on paper. It hasn't been for almost 2 years." I explained it to him slowly, the way I'd explain a complicated closing to a first-time buyer who'd never seen a settlement statement before. The foreclosure notice I'd found behind the fruit bowl, the 90-day countdown, the refinance under my name, the life estate the attorney had drawn up specifically so he could never be at risk of losing his home again regardless of what happened to me or my finances. I told him about paying off Diane's home equity line without ever mentioning it to her. I told him the quitclaim deed had been recorded with the county for almost 2 years, quietly, searchable by anyone who knew to look, which up until 3 weeks ago had been exactly nobody in our family except me. He didn't say anything for almost 30 seconds. I could hear him breathing, and somewhere in the background, the television on low, Diane's voice asking who he was talking to. "You own my house," he finally said. Not accusatory. Just stunned, turning the fact over like he was still trying to find the shape of it. "I own the house you live in for free, for the rest of your life, protected by a life estate an attorney drew up specifically to protect you," I said. "There's a difference." If you've ever had to explain a hard truth to someone you love, slowly, clearly, without flinching, you already know how exhausting that kind of honesty is. I walked him through what the life estate actually meant in plain terms, that he could never be evicted, that the arrangement was legally binding regardless of anything that happened between us personally, that this had never been about control, it had been about survival, his and, in a strange way, mine too, because I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd let that house go to auction while I had the means to stop it. But I also had to tell him the practical consequence of what he'd just asked Tyler to help arrange. He could not take out a home equity line against a property he no longer held title to. Any lender running a title search would immediately discover the quitclaim deed, discover my name on record, and discover that Walter Calloway had no legal standing to encumber that property with new debt. Which meant that within days, whatever. I want to be honest about something before I tell you how the Tyler conversation actually happened, because I think it matters for understanding who I am in this story. I did not call Tyler that night to confront him. I didn't call him the next morning either. I let 4 full days pass deliberately because I've learned, both professionally and personally, that the person who moves first out of anger usually loses the leverage that patience would have given them. Anger makes you generous with information you don't need to give away yet. Patience makes you precise. Instead, I spent those 4 days doing exactly what I do at work when a deal gets complicated and emotions start running ahead of the facts. I gathered documentation. Methodically. Almost ritualistically if I'm honest, because there was something steadying about the process, something that let me feel like I was standing on solid ground instead of the shifting, uncertain terrain the rest of my family seemed to be navigating that week. I drove to the County Register of Deeds on my lunch break Monday and pulled a certified copy of the recorded quitclaim deed. The same kind of document I request for clients a dozen times a month, except this time my own name sat in the grantee line, plain black ink on official paper, time-stamped almost 2 years earlier. I pulled the life estate agreement my attorney, a woman named Patricia Ruiz who'd handled the closing quietly and confidentially, had drafted specifically to protect my father. 6 pages of dense legal language that boiled down to one simple guarantee. He could live in that house until the day he died, and nothing I did, nothing that happened to my finances, my marriage prospects, my life in general, could ever change that. I pulled the payoff statement showing Diane's home equity line had been satisfied and released, with my own name. Not my father's, not Diane's. Listed as the party who'd submitted the funds, dated 14 months earlier. I even pulled the original foreclosure notice, the one I'd found behind the fruit bowl, because I wanted a complete record, start to finish, of exactly what had happened and exactly when. I organized all of it into a single folder, tabbed the way I tab a closing package for a first-time buyer who needs everything airtight before they'll sign anything, because on some level I think I already knew this folder wasn't just for me. I think some part of me knew it would eventually need to answer questions from people who didn't believe me, or didn't want to believe me, or needed to see something in black and white before they could accept a version of events that didn't center Tyler as the family's obvious success story. What they didn't know was that by the time Tyler found out anything at all, there would be nothing left to argue about, because every fact would already be on paper, signed, sealed, and recorded 2 years before he'd ever asked my father for a dime. The Sunday call. The call came from Tyler himself on a Sunday afternoon, not from me. I was folding laundry when my phone lit up with his name, and I remember pausing with a towel half folded in my hands, feeling a strange, calm certainty settle over me. The same feeling I get right before I walk into a closing I already know is going to be difficult. My father, it turned out, hadn't been able to hold the secret the way I might have. 3 days after our conversation, according to what Tyler told me and what my father later confirmed, Walter had sat Tyler down at the kitchen table, the same table incidentally where the watch had been mocked weeks earlier, and explained, as gently as he knew how, that he couldn't help with the $15,000 because the house wasn't in his name anymore. Hadn't been for almost 2 years. Tyler's version of gently, when he called me 20 minutes after that conversation ended, was considerably less gentle. "What did you do?" he said, no hello, no preamble. His voice already climbing toward the register I recognized from 100 family gatherings, loud enough to fill a room, confident enough to assume the room would side with him by default, the way it always had. I stayed calm, the way I stay calm on a call with an angry seller who's just discovered a lien they didn't know existed and wants someone else to be at fault for it. "I refinanced the house 2 years ago to stop it from going into foreclosure," I said, setting the towel down, walking to my kitchen table and sitting, because I wanted my voice steady and my body still. "Dad was 90 days from losing it, Tyler. 90 days. Nobody else in this family noticed, including you. That doesn't give you the right to just take it behind everyone's back." His voice cracked slightly on take, like the word itself was too large for what he actually meant. "Here's a pattern interrupt, because I want you to notice something with me. Notice how quickly the story in Tyler's mouth transformed from a rescue into a theft. That's not an accident. And if you've ever watched a family reorganize the facts of a situation in real time to protect someone's ego, you already recognize exactly what was happening on that call. That's what happens when someone's entire identity in a family depends on being the golden child, on being the one everyone roots for, and suddenly there's a folder full of certified documents proving that the boring sister, the one whose gifts got laughed at, whose birthdays got forgotten, whose sacrifices went unnoticed for over a decade, was the actual reason the family still had a house to gather in at all. "I didn't take anything," I said, keeping my voice level even as my pulse climbed. "I paid $18,600 to cure a default that was 90 days from a foreclosure auction. I paid off $22,000 of Diane's home equity line, quietly, without telling her, because I didn't want her to feel exposed. I've been paying a mortgage on that house every single month for 2 years, on top of my own rent, so that Dad could keep living there without ever knowing how close he came to losing it. The deed reflects who actually owns the property, Tyler. That's not me taking something. That's paperwork finally catching up to reality. Not dramatically. Not with fireworks or confrontation or anyone storming out of a room. Just quietly, the way foundations shift. Imperceptibly at first, and then one day you notice the door doesn't close quite the same way it used to, and you realize something underneath has moved for good. My father started sending me small, almost shy photos in the weeks after. A fixed leaky faucet, a freshly repainted section of fence, a new smoke detector installed in the hallway, accompanied by short texts like "finally got around to this" or "thought you'd want to see." I understood, without him needing to explain it, that these photos were a kind of apology, a wordless way of showing me he was finally taking the property seriously, finally treating it like something worth protecting, now that he understood exactly what protecting it had cost me. And at the next family gathering, months later, over a much smaller and quieter Labor Day dinner, someone brought up gifts in passing, an offhand joke about a cousin's questionable taste in presents, and I watched the table go careful in a way it never had before. Nobody laughed too loudly. Nobody looked toward me expecting an easy target. Tyler, seated near the end of the table, caught my eye for just a moment and gave a small, tight nod that wasn't quite an apology but wasn't nothing either. The room had learned the hard way that the quiet ones are sometimes the only reason the house is still standing at all, and that the next time they laughed at something small, they'd better be certain it was actually small. Here's the finalize, ending CTA, and polished YouTube description. Chapter 8, What I Kept, What I Let Go. People ask me sometimes, now that this story has made its way around the family in pieces, whether I feel like I won something. I never know quite how to answer that because winning implies there was a war, and I never once thought of it that way, not even in the moments I had the most leverage in that house. What I feel, if I'm honest, is something closer to relief. The specific relief of no longer performing invisibility just to keep the peace. For years, I thought love in that family meant disappearing quietly and doing the work nobody noticed. I know now that real love, the kind my mother tried to teach me before she died, never once asked me to disappear. It only asked me to show up consistently, honestly, even when nobody was watching. I didn't take the house from my father. I gave him back the 90 days he didn't know he was losing. I gave Diane the truth she needed to finally sleep at night. And I gave myself something I didn't even know I was missing: permission to stop being quiet about what I carry. The watch still sits in my nightstand drawer. I never told my father to buy a real one. He didn't need to. Every second still counts. I just stopped needing anyone else to notice that but me. If you've ever been the responsible one, the quiet one, the one nobody thought to thank, I hope you remember that was never the truth about you. It was only ever the story other people were too comfortable to question. If this story resonated with you, tell me where you're listening from. And if you've ever been underestimated by your own family, drop a comment. I read every single one.